A report from Group 17 by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 7. Allie tried to call out, but could not. Something thick and black had been drawn over her head, and a strong hand held it hard against her face. A sharp, hot pain stabbed her shoulder and sent fire down her arm and up her neck, up to her head. She heard a thud and recognized the sound of the gate closing behind her. Then she turned, freezing cold, and went to sleep. When she awoke, she was lying on her back on a hard surface, and faces were moving above her in circles and looking down at her. For a long time, her eyes would not work right, and when they did, the faces swam together into one face and stopped moving. It was the animal keeper, the old one with the thick round glasses and the wispy gray hair. He was watching her eyes, and at length he spoke. "I think you are waking up now." She tried to answer, but all that came from her throat was a blurred sigh. She could not make her mouth work. She tried to sit up, but her muscles would not respond. "I have given you some medicine. You will be all right. The medicine will make you feel nice." That was true. She did feel nice, though she did not know where she was. All she could see was the face and the ceiling straight overhead, which looked like cement painted white and made her think of a basement. She could hear some noises, however. One was a faint whirring, as of a small motor running quietly like a refrigerator. Another was a scuffling sound that stopped and started. She could not identify it, though it was familiar. She forgot it almost at once, tried again to speak, and failed again. She wanted to ask the animal keeper where she was. Then she remembered the gate. She must be somewhere inside the wall. She thought of her mother. Her mother would be home now and expecting her because it was getting late. A twinge of worry flicked in her mind and then died out. She went back to sleep. A little later, still not quite awake, not quite able to come awake, she had the sensation of being carried, an arm beneath her shoulders, her own arm dangling, her wrist brushing something cold, a stone floor. Then she was lying on her back again. She strained at her eyelids and they opened for a moment. She looked at the same white ceiling, but there was a pattern of curlicues before it, gray lines. She recognized them from having looked down at the animal place. They were wire. She was in a cage. The scuffling noise was closer now. The bass were striking the May waxwing, a fact which made Fergus O'Neill happier at his employment than he had anticipated, happy enough to ignore, at least momentarily, a nagging increase in his misgivings. He was fond of fishing, and though he did not scorn spinning tackle, the flatfish, the rapala minnow, or even the earthworm, he preferred the purer art of fly casting. He realized, with almost a sense of shock, that his fly rod had not been out of its case in more than 3 years. Working on the bee virus, he had excluded most other things from his mind. There was an involuntary aestheticism characteristic of such research, at least in the case of Fergus, among things excluded, not deliberately, but merely not thought about, where parties, dates, and holidays and fishing went with them. He flicked his line over the river and watched a small bass lunge for the fly and miss it. The bigger ones would be in closer to the bank. The increase in his misgivings had come about in the course of acquiring the aluminum canoe in which he sat, clad in pullover and corduroy slacks, his tackle box at his feet. It was a simple enough revelation, casually made, but it came at the end of a series of bits of information which, like a column of ones and twos, insisted on being added together. He flicked his line again and added, "A remark by Colonel Attenborough. The cabin he occupied stood on an estate which belonged to Mr. Nunneley Wilcox." The name was puzzlingly familiar. Then Fergus placed it. Nunneley Wilcox had been for some years Under-Secretary of State. He was rich, quietly famous, retired, and still served as an occasional presidential advisor. A remark by Mr. Bales. The aerial photograph he had left with Fergus, of which Mr. Bales was very proud, had been made with equipment developed for U-2s and orbiting satellites. Spy equipment, rare, secret, and enormously expensive. A remark by Colonel Attenborough. An aluminum canoe, rented from a commercial boathouse downriver, had been placed in the estate boathouse for Fergus's use. But when he went to the boathouse, he found not one but 3 canoes, 2 of which belonged to the estate. Why rent one? He was not sure, but a thought occurred to him. A rental canoe was anonymous. Did they expect, then, that he would be watched? A conversation with Mr. Nunneley Wilcox himself. Fergus had gone to the estate house to get a key to the boathouse. It was a handsome Georgian mansion overlooking a lake on which white geese swam. At the door, a maid in uniform answered his ring, asked him in, and informed him that Mr. Wilcox would like to see him. Mr. Wilcox was in his study, a polished wood and leather chamber with a view of the geese. He was white-haired, tall, hawk-nosed, and cordial. He inquired politely as to whether all in the log cabin had been prepared to Fergus's satisfaction. Then he added, "I hope it's not too uncomfortable. My sons and I built that cabin ourselves. Sort of an exercise in pioneering. We don't ordinarily let it. In fact, you're the first tenant we've had. I got a phone call from Jake Ewers, and he sounded quite urgent, so I didn't argue. He's an old friend." Again, a famous name. Dr. Jacob Ewers was the director of the agency for which Mr. Bales worked. The subject had changed to fishing, and it was Mr. Wilcox, as he handed Fergus the boathouse key, who advised him that the bass should, at this season, be taking May waxwings. Throughout the interview, he was noticeably uncurious as to why Fergus was present at all. Taken singly, none of these things was a cause for concern. Put together, a steel case chained to a wrist, a chartered plane, $1 million spy camera, a phone call from a director to a presidential advisor, a camouflaged canoe, they gave Fergus the uneasy feeling that he was caught up in a conflict bigger and more urgently menacing than Colonel Attenborough was willing to admit. His reassurance was, of course, that he was not really caught up in it. He could and would bow politely and walk away when he wanted to. He had launched the canoe at the dock in front of the Wilcox boathouse. The river here resembled a wide and placid lake. Fergus drifted gently downstream, aided by a mild breeze, the spring sunshine pleasantly warm on the back of his neck, except for a solitary fisherman in a red punt near the opposite bank. There was no one in sight. He tried to remember that his objective was not a string of bass, but the Villa Petrograd. Mr. Bales had cautioned him, "You won't be able to see much, but at least you'll get an idea of the physical appearance of the riverfront, how close the wall is to it, where the dock is. I wouldn't try climbing the wall. Then, after you've seen it, read the reports and see what you make of them." He saw the wall after floating a half-mile downstream, catching 3 large bass and throwing back half a dozen small ones. One might as well make the cover authentic. He would give 2 to Mr. Wilcox and cook 1 for his supper. He fished close to the bank, which most of the way was flat and grassy, the meadow his log cabin looked down on. It would be flooded in high water and soggy underfoot near the edge, but as the lake narrowed to turn back into a river, the steep bluffs closed in on it from either side. Here the wall loomed up unexpectedly. One did not see it from a distance because it was shadowed by large trees, already in leaf, that grew along its inner side. He paddled closer and stared up at it. It was an almost painful incongruity in this sylvan valley. It rose from the stone palisade, and a cornice had been blasted or drilled away to accommodate its base. The cornice was itself fully 10 feet above water level, and to this, the wall and its spiked top added another 10. The effect was not that of a rich man's estate, but an insane bastion built by a xenophobe. He let the canoe drift until he faced approximately the middle of its span. The current grew swifter here, where the wide lake narrowed. Farther downstream, it must grow narrower still, for he could hear the rush of a rapids. He lowered the canoe's small anchor, flicked his May waxwing toward the shore, and stared beyond it into the shadows. Directly in front of him lay the small peninsula, perhaps 30 feet long, the only place on the length of the wall where dry land extended a useful distance beyond it. At this spot, the river's bank rose more gently, and rough steps had been cut into it, leading to the iron gate visible in the deep shadow only as a darker square in the wall. At the end of the peninsula, near where his bass fly drifted, stood the square cement block. He watched the May waxwing float to within a foot of it, accelerate suddenly, and then, to his astonishment, sink from sight. He thought at first of a fish, but there was no swirl, no splash, no strike. He lifted his rod, and the top bent solidly, motionlessly. It was snagged. Somehow, inexplicably, a surface fly on the end of a floating fly line had sunk and snagged itself underwater on the Villa Petrograd's dock. Fergus weighed anchor and paddled forward, stopping every few strokes to reel in line. The dock he approached was plain, rather an ugly gray. It merely squared off the end of the stone peninsula, rising perhaps a foot out of the water and measuring 8 or 9 feet on a side. It looked solid enough. He wondered what had led Mr. Bales to suspect it. Easily answered. In Mr. Bales' profession, one must attempt to suspect everything, even a block of cement. The side of the canoe scraped against it. Fergus put down his rod and paddle, pushed off a foot, and took hold of his line, staring down to see where the end had gone. A small green leaf, floating lightly on the surface, swirled in a circle and sank gently into a miniature whirlpool. His line was just in its vortex. His fly had not simply sunk, it had been sucked under. Tracing the line, he put his hand into the water and felt the small current pulling downward past his fingers. Rolling up his sleeve, he leaned over and nearly capsized the canoe. He swore mildly, straightened, and considered. The dock was unusual as docks go, in that there was nothing to tie up to. At length, holding the anchor in his hand, he climbed onto it and found himself standing on a sign stenciled in the cement, "No trespassing." He placed the anchor on the sign and lay chest down beside it. He reached as far as into the water as he could. It was cold, barely above freezing, and made his arm ache. About a foot below the surface, following his line down, he found the barred opening. He leaned his head over and could see it, but not well. The water was murky and the angle bad. The bars were round metal pipes set 2 inches apart. The opening itself looked about 2 feet square. He could see nothing inside it but blackness. His line had passed between 2 of the bars. Thrusting his hand after it, he learned where it had gone. Just beside the square opening, he felt the round mouth of a 2-inch pipe into which river water was flowing briskly. His May waxwing had been sucked in with the current. He wrapped the line twice around his hand, keeping it close to the pipe's end, and tugged hard. It came free. The fly, now hopelessly soaked and bedraggled, had gone up the pipe about 3 feet and caught on something. Perhaps a bend? An elbow? More interesting was the question of the flow itself. Mr. Bales had said nothing of pipes or pumps, but only instruments. Since the intake was set off to the side of the barred opening, it was possible that his scuba diver had simply missed it, especially if the pump, wherever it might be, had not been running at the time. And where was the pump? Definitely not here. And there was no sound of machinery running. Somewhere inside the wall? But why? What need would the Russians in Villa Petrograd have for so much water? Struck by a thought, Fergus crossed to the other side of the dock and lay down again. There, a foot below the surface, was a duplicate barred opening, precisely opposite the first one. Reaching down, he found the matching pipe. From this one, the water flowed out. He had just risen from this discovery and was contemplating it when the gate opened and a man descended the stone steps. He was dressed in work clothes and the heavy shoes of a groundskeeper. When he reached Fergus, he spoke in a heavy Russian accent. "Is private, keep out." "Sorry," said Fergus, and added a mere truth. "A fish ran with my line, and it got snagged on your dock. I was just freeing it." The man looked at him with stony incomprehension and repeated, "Is private, keep out." It was seemingly the extent of his English. Fergus picked up his rod and line, lifted his string of bass from the canoe. "Fish," he said, holding them up to make his mission clear. The other made an equally clear gesture. He pointed at Fergus, at the canoe, and at the opposite bank of the river. He said again, "Is private, keep out." As he paddled away, Fergus thought, "I have had my first skirmish with the enemy and have emerged with the advantage. I have learned something he has not." At least he was fairly sure that the Russians had taken him for an ordinary fisherman. From the nature of the encounter, Fergus could guess that others had come before him. He had been chased by rote. The flow of water in and out was curious. It was obviously being pumped to a point some distance away from the dock, being used for something and then piped back to the river. It might mean nothing. It might have no connection with Dr. Schutz. It could be used to cool an air conditioner, for instance. They would hardly need air conditioning today, but they could be testing it. He should have paid more attention to the outflow. Had it been warmer than the river? Not much, or he would have noticed it. It would be interesting to fill a small bottle with it. He had none with him, but surely the colonel could provide one. Near the bank, across from the villa, he made a few more casts, having replaced his soggy waxwing with a fresh one. But it was past mid-morning, moving toward noon, and the bass had ceased to rise. They would start again at dusk. He turned upstream, back into the wide lake, heading for the cabin, but staying close to the far shore, and scouting for sights to fish in the evening. The red punt had gone. Across the river he observed a small drama, not quite comprehensible to him because he could not hear the dialogue. At the edge of the meadow that began where the wall ended, a police car stood, identifiable by its domed roof light. Beside it, 2 men in gray uniforms and tan hats, obviously state or county police, stood talking to a woman and a boy. The boy was holding the woman's hand. She wore light brown slacks and a green sweater. From a distance, at least, she looked rather pretty and appealing, seemingly in distress, for when she turned toward the river, he thought he could see, even so far away, that her face looked sad. And that is the end of chapter 7.